You know, I always talk about when you're building computers, there's certain components that you shouldn't necessarily cheap out on because of the fact that you have, you know, it's their use of lifespan. How long can you reuse the part in future builds to make it make sense? And one of those things where I always say, make sure you don't like save too much money because you want good quality and longevity out of it are power supplies. So that's why through the help of NZXT in today's video, we're gonna do a PSA, PSU here on JTC.
We interrupt this video to bring you a special message from iFixit. No, we interrupt this interruption with this interruption about new stuff from iFixit. Wish you had a new graphics card, but inventory sucks? Fix the inventory problems with iFixit. Whoa, don't drop it. Can't fix that with iFixit. Just kidding, yes you can. Wish you could take iFixit with you anywhere, but your pockets aren't big enough? Introducing the new More
And the new Minnow.
Take them with you anywhere. So get iFixit for your loved ones, or just get them for yourself.
You know, one of the trends that you'll notice with power supplies as we move forward, especially if you've shopped for one recently, is you might notice that a 500 watt power supply these days is pretty inexpensive and oftentimes not enough because we go through this weird cycle, and not really a Moore's Law cycle, but just a design philosophy with like Intel, AMD, NVIDIA, where they'll scale up the size of the die and it gets hungry for power and it's just hot and it's cumbersome, but it's fast and it's powerful. And then over time, it sort of becomes more efficient, and then the temperatures, maybe the coolers grow to meet the demand. But anyway, the temperatures get more under control, and then they scale up again, and we kind of get this this weird sort of a hourglass-shaped effect of sort of what Intel called tick-tock for the longest time, their tick-tock release structures. So power supplies have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, here in America, we are on 115 volt. For homes and stuff, which means we can only go about as big as 1500, 1600 watts on 15 amp circuits here in the US. 20 amp circuits are a thing, but in homes, not really. It's mostly 15 amp, which means our power supplies can only get so big. But if you're in Europe and you are on one of those 220 volts or 240, whichever it is, I can't remember, I think it's 240, your power supplies are actually more efficient than we get here in the United States. And you have bigger options that would be available to you out in that region. So everything I'm talking about today is going to be specific to at least North America. And I don't even know if this perfectly applies to Canada. I can only speak to here in the US, which is where I live. But anyway, power supplies have gotten bigger and bigger. And you might find that the medium-sized power supply that you're finding on the market now that's somewhat affordable and can kind of cover all your equipment and your system, hungry graphics cards, high core count CPUs, lots of RAM, lots of storage, is going to be about 1,000 watts. Now, fortunately, 1,000 watt gold power supplies, 1,000 watt bronze power supplies are not nearly as expensive as they used to be. There's a while there, if you wanted a 1,000 watt power supply, you were paying $200+. Anyway, this is a C850 gold from NZXT. We also have a C1000 gold right here. We'll talk about some of the basics of things you need to consider. Now, you might have heard the term digital power supply a lot. And there's a lot of misconceptions of what digital power supplies actually are. People think if there's a display on the side, if it shows you some sort of a reading of what your wattage from the wall is, or et cetera, oh, that's a digital power supply. Or it's got some sort of a plug that'll connect to USB on your motherboard and it has some sort of a control software that you can see live wattage and stuff. Oh, that's a digital power supply. No, digital power supply just refers specifically to the actual power monitoring built into the power supply so that it can react quickly to both load and unload situations. So when you start up a game and your power supply goes from idle state, or your graphics card goes from an idle state to a 3D state, it can go anywhere from like 200 or so megahertz to like 3,000 megahertz, like that. Now that's a quick, sudden draw on the power supply. And having a digital power supply is able to monitor those loads and the actual amps and the power draw on the 12 volt rails, even the 5.5 and 3 volt rails, and respond to it much faster than an analog power supply. So anyway, I just want to point that out. Now, all NZXT power supplies here that we're taking a look at right now, these are digital power supplies. But what I want to point out, in fact, you know what? I'll put the 850 away. Because one of the things I think people might find beneficial in modern power supplies is the fact that they're getting smaller and powerful. There was a while there, 1,000 watt power supply would have been like as long as this box, okay? But if we look at this right here, this is the exact same size as the 850, but this is a 1,000 watt digital, fully modular power supply. Now what does fully modular mean? Fully modular simply means every single cable on the back can disconnect. That includes the CPU cables, 24-pin PCI Express cables for your graphics cards, SATA cables for either your SATA plugs or your Molex plugs for your peripherals, controllers, fan controllers, RGB controllers, the whole deal. A semi-modular power supply usually means at least one of the PCI Express cables, the CPU power cables, and the 24-pin are hardwired to the power supply coming out through a grommet, and those cables can't be removed. You know why? Because those are required for your PC to run anyway. You're not going to remove them. What would be removable would be any extra power or PCI Express cables and SATA and Molex cables. So that's the difference between modular and semi-modular. One of the things that's nice about pretty much every single power supply these days is the fact that it's automatic input switching. What do I mean by that? Well, I talked about those regions earlier, right? The United States is on a completely different hertz and voltage rating or voltage system, especially for homes, than anywhere in Europe or the UK. So what that means is, back in the day, there used to be a little red toggle button, and you had to toggle 115 or 220. And if you didn't, wasn't that big of a deal if you left it on 220 here in the United States. It may not power on, but wasn't gonna hurt anything. But if you left it set to 115, and then you plug 220 into it in Europe, this quickly turns into a fireworks show. Or at least the internal capacitors and or circuit breakers inside will pop, and then it'll just be a really fast fireworks show and then it's over. But the nice thing is it's automatic now. It senses what the input voltage is and then just automatically switches over the breaker system to be able to account for it, which is nice. So I wanted to point that out. Now let's go ahead and talk about why you might need to update your power supply if you're buying next gen hardware. When I say next gen, I mean pretty much anything 5000 series Ryzen and up, anything like 10th gen Intel and up. If you're running a 5, 6, 7-year-old power supply, you might only have one CPU 4+4 pin. Now back in the day, CPUs only needed 2 12 volts and 2 grounds going to the actual CPU supplemental power on your motherboard, and that was it. Then 8 became a thing, which was just 2 4s put together and plugged in. But now you might find 2 8-pin, what they call EPS power for your CPU, for the higher power consumption CPUs out there, like your 13th gen, your 12th gen, even your 10th gen. For sure, your high core count AMD Ryzen CPUs, especially AM5 CPUs. In fact, if you're running Threadripper or even super high-end motherboards, you're trying to do overclocking, you might find 2 8-pins plus a 4-pin. So at that point already, if you don't have at least 2 of the CPU headers on the back of your power supply, and you're trying to run a modern CPU, sure, it will run with only one plugged in, but it's recommended to go ahead and populate both of the EPS connectors on your motherboard just for super stable, clean power to your CPU. The cleaner the power you can supply, the more stable your CPU system is going to be, especially if you start overclocking it. So if you only have one CPU EPS power on your power supply, it might be time to upgrade. Now the same can go for your PCI Express. PCI Express is an interesting thing right now because we are in the in-between or the interim between ATX 2.0 and ATX 3.0 power supplies. Now ATX 3.0 is actually utilizing the PCIe Gen 5 or 5.0 12 volt high power plug. Now I don't need to really go into details about that. You guys have probably seen a million videos about those plugs. The difference here is the fact that the power supply is providing a direct cable that goes from whichever plug they're using on the back of the power supply to that 12 volt connector, which will plug directly in to your graphics card, alleviating the need to have any sort of adapter. Adapters, short of any of the shortcomings and issues of not being seated all the way or melting or whatever, anytime you add a connection point, you add a potential point of failure. And it's the same thing with like water cooling. The more fittings you have in there, the more connectors you have, the more points of failure. And it's not saying it will fail, it's an opportunity or a place where something could fail. Not to mention it's just cleaner to have a single run of single cable without adapters plugging into your components. Because if you're spending a decent amount of money on your power supply, you're more than likely spending a decent amount of money on your system, which means you want nice, clean cable management to have to show that off. The difference you're gonna find on lower wattage power supplies, because the NZXT-C series starts at 550 watts, and it's available in both bronze and gold. Gold is very common now. You'll find platinum and titanium, and all that refers to is the efficiency rating at 50% load. So the higher the efficiency, the higher the rating of the more precious of the metal. But it's funny, it's not a huge difference between gold and platinum, but it's definitely an ability to market, hey, these are better quality power supplies, they're more efficient, which means less power draw from the wall to get you the advertised power, which means less heat, less energy waste, less cost to run your system if there's less energy waste. And more of that power makes it to your system rather than being lost to heat. So that's just a very high level way of efficiency being explained with your power supply. But when it comes to PCI Express cables, the lower wattage power supplies, like the 550s and the 650s, probably will only have one cable with a pigtail, maybe two with a pigtail, and that's it. Long gone are the days of SLI. SLI was the reason why you would find power supplies with like 4 PCI Express cables going from the back of the power supply off into your system, because you might have had 2 graphics cards that required 2 or 3 8-pin PCI Express. So the reason why you'd find a ton of PCI Express connectors on the back of your power supply would be for SLI. Now with things being sort of converting to the 12-volt high power, or AMD still using the standard PCI Express cables, and more than likely 2 of them, probably 3 on the custom cards, you're gonna want to make sure that you have cables that are direct to your power supply, or to your graphics card. What do I mean by that? The 12-volt high power connectors to your graphics card are gonna terminate to either 2, 3, possibly 4 PCI Express plugs on the back of your power supply, depending on the spec and the route at which the power supply maker goes. Now these are not ATX 3.0 power supplies, so the only way you'd be able to get a cable that terminates from the back of the modular connectors here to your graphics card is gonna be if you order a custom one from like CableMod or something like that. And those are available in both 3 and 4 PCI Express cable connectors. So you'd wanna make sure, obviously, that you have at least one available PCI Express port to each one of the cables that are needed for that adapter cable. But besides that, all your SATA and your Molex, at least on the NZXT power supplies, they're the same plug and they're interchangeable. And so you can plug Molex or SATA into any one of these, which is ever most convenient when it comes to cable routing. And all of those have daisy chain plugs, which means you're gonna have 4 of either the SATA or the Molex plugs on the back of that. Now, other nice to haves, this particular power supply, the C1000, has a 0 dB fan, which means the fan won't turn on until the power supply sees either a certain temperature or a certain load threshold be exceeded, which would turn on the fan to start cooling down the 12-volt rail, the capacitors, the VRMs, everything on this power supply which can generate heat. So that's just controlled by a toggle button on the back right here. You can turn that on or off. I tend to leave 0 dB off on my systems because the fan is PWM, which means it will also speed up and slow down with load. So I prefer to just let it run low RPM while it's on all the time. And the reason why people tend to go with 0 dB is twofold. 1, noise, and 2, dust accumulation. If the fan isn't moving, dust isn't getting blown into the power supply. Because it pulls air in through the grill, goes down through the components, and then out the back of the PC, which is where this mesh side is here, where the power plug is. If it's running slow, it's providing some airflow with those components, but dust isn't too much of a problem, especially if you have a dust filter on the front of it. But on all my power supplies that have any sort of a 0 dB mode, I disable it. I leave it going full time. Oh, and then you've got your power toggle switch, which of course is present on pretty much any modern power supply. I remember when this became a thing, and it was so cool to be like, I don't have to unplug my power supply to turn it off and work on it. I can just toggle the switch. I still toggle it off and unplug my plug out of habit because of the fact that it's like, I can't tell you how many times I thought it was off and it was on, and vice versa. Little side note here, if the power supply's on, the switch is on and the system's off and power's going to the motherboard, did you know if you seat a graphics card in it, most of the time it'll turn the system on? And that's kind of scary. Ask me how I know all that. Anyway, power supplies, guys, are not something that typically people think about being fun or exciting when it comes to building your computer. It is literally the fuel for your system. I always use car analogies because I'm a car slut. I love cars. But it's the equivalent of building a high horsepower engine and using crap low octane gas. What happens to your system or your engine if you run crap low octane gas and it's a high compression, high performance engine? It becomes a high compression, high performance engine with windows in it, okay? Not Windows, like Microsoft Windows. I mean, you can actually, the parts play peekaboo, people. They pop out the sides because bad things happen. Now your system isn't gonna start creating additional windows and having components throw itself out the side of the box, but you'll feel like they did if you have a crap power supply blowing up stuff in your system. The other thing that also you should consider when it comes to power supplies is the warranty. NZXT offers a 10-year warranty with their power supplies. Now that's a peace of mind warranty. What does that mean? One, it covers pretty much anything. Any sort of failure with the power supply will be covered by NZXT. Usually failures with power supplies, people think, oh my God, the power supply failed and it killed all my components. That's extremely rare that that happens. What tends to happen is the power supply just stops clicking on, which means your system won't turn on if the power supply is gonna fail. The reason why I'm even bringing this up, these types of warranties have been around for a long time. 5-year warranties were like the standard, then 7-year became like, oh my God, and now 10-year. If you have a warranty, a power supply warranty that has 7 years and you're towards the end of that warranty, you fall exactly in the camp that I'm explaining right now, that your power supply is more than likely out of date in terms of its compatibility, power rating, efficiency, and just what plugs are available on it for modern next-gen hardware. So that's why it might be time for you to start shopping for a new power supply for your system. These are just, these are necessities for your system, but they're just not fun and exciting. Let's face it, the fun and exciting stuff in your system, your graphics card, right? Your CPU, when you turn on Cinebench and you go, look at all those little worker ants go, and you're like, check out this 40,000 plus score. Do you go, check out my 1,500 watts? Do you show off your car at the car show, your 1,000 horsepower, and you're like, yep, I'm running Chevron 93. It's literally the fuel for your computer. Don't scrimp out on it. It's important. And you know what? If you buy a nice, high quality, high power supply, it will take care of you for years and years. It will probably be the last component in your system that you upgrade because it stays relevant the longest. Anyway, huge thanks to NZXT for sending us some power supplies to take a look at here. Basically, it has everything that we look for in systems. 80 plus gold is more than enough for modern systems. If you want higher efficiency systems, look for anything that has a higher 80 plus rating on it, whether it be gold or platinum, titanium. NZXT has a full line of power supplies at different ratings and stuff, but gold is a good value. Weird thing, that's a weird sentence to say. Gold is a great value because of the fact that it offers the features that you're looking for without breaking the bank. Fully modular power supply or semi-modular, depending on the power supply series you go with from NZXT, which means they're efficient. They've got 0 dB fan mode, fluid dynamic bearing fans in here, so they're very quiet. Fully modular, I've already said fully modular, but allowing you to disconnect cables that you don't need, keeping less cable clutter in your system. You know, they'll fit in just about anything because they're just a standard ATX size power supply at 1,000 watts. So check out the description down below. You guys will find some links to NZXT's power supplies. If you're looking at next gen stuff and you're running an old power supply and you don't think everything I was saying today is important, I'll be here to say I told you so when you find out the power supply may not be up to snuff. All right, guys, thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.